Thank you for joining this panel session this afternoon. My name is Robert Karanja, Senior Director at Co-Develop, and I will be moderating our panel session this afternoon titled DPI Brewed in an African Port, an analysis of DPI adoption in Africa, and we'll get to hear from some subject matter experts. We have a panel that has lots of years of experience, many of whom I've worked with in the past and currently, and we look forward to hearing from all of them. I wanted to ask a question before I started. I had the wonderful opportunity of titling this panel session, DPI Brewed in an African Port. Is anybody familiar with the famous movie that was made in Ghana many years ago that was called Love Brewed in an African Port? Yes. By a show of hands? Yes. So when I thought about how best can we think about DPI on the continent, I did think about that movie, which was one of the first worldwide hits that was produced on the continent. And so we titled this DPI Brewed in an African Port. So I'll just take a seat and walk us through this session, and then we'll have introductions from all our panelists for a few minutes, quickly followed by a lightning talk that will be presented by Dr. Jane Munga, and then we will have a few questions out to the panel and hopefully close this out in good time. And I'm sorry we're starting late, but there's not much that I could do for this late start. So let me just grab my seat and we'll get started. Use the clicker? Yes, I'll give this to okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. As mentioned, my name is Robert Karanja, Senior Director at Co-Develop, and I will have my panel introduce themselves, starting from my right, going right through till the end. Sabine?
Okay. Hello, my name is Sabine Mensah. I'm Deputy CEO at African Enda Foundation. And at African Enda, we believe that we should all have a universal right access to financial services in Africa. And to make that a reality, we work with governments, regulators, private sector associations to build inclusive instant payment systems at a country level or at a regional level that really enable easy access, affordable access, and payment systems that replicate more value than what you can do with cash for the 400 million plus adults that are financially excluded in Africa. So it's an honor to be here on behalf of my team.
Thank you. Luke?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Mate. I'm the Director for Systems Development and Support under the Office of the President for the Electronic Government Division, famously known as Smart Zambia. So at Smart Zambia, we are charged with the mandate of digital transformation for the public sector in the Republic of Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you. Riham?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Riham Awad. I work for the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology of Egypt for the past 12 years. My specialization is in digital transformation with focus area of strategies. My expertise for the past 30 years was through the government from a capacity building perspective, small and medium enterprises, and lately focused on the digital transformation.
Thank you. Jane?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jane Munga. I'm with the Carnegie Endowment for Africa program. The Carnegie Endowment is a think tank. We are based in Washington, D.C., but with footprints across the world. I focus on digital technologies for Africa. In particular, I try and provide new insights on how we can fast-track Africa's digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Magdi?
Assalamu alaikum and karibu and ahlan and hello. My name is Magdi Amin. I have worked on digital issues for quite a while, and I spent about a decade at the World Bank and then IFC. Worked with Madakar at Omidyar Network on ID systems. That's probably my claim to fame. I then worked at the government of Sudan, and now I run a fund which invests in innovative tech startups in Africa called African Renaissance Ventures, and I sit on the co-develop investment committee. Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Alice.
Thank you very much. My name is Alice Munoz. I'm with Mozilla Corporation. Mozilla has long been at the forefront of shaping responsible technology. We are the owners of one of the only independent browser, the Firefox browser, used by hundreds of millions of people. We've been advocating for a better internet, and central to this mission is the principle of openness, which we believe can play a really vital role in improving transparency and accountability, especially in DPI in the Africa region. We would like to see an ecosystem where principles and values of openness, which include diversity, diverse input, innovation, public participation, public orientation, inclusivity, trust, transparency, accountability, are prioritized. Those are the principles of openness. I am the senior director. I run Africa's program called the Africa Mradi. Mradi means program in Kiswahili. And asanteni sana. Back to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you to everyone else. So now we'll listen to a lightning talk from Dr. Jane Munga, where she will focus on some guidelines looking at digital public infrastructure, practical approach to Africa. Jane, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon again. Hope you can hear me. Oh, perfect. I know I'm standing here between you and thoughts of dinner, so I'll try and be quick. So it's a pleasure again to be here and just to discuss about digital transformation, especially in the aspect of DPI. We've been hearing about DPI since morning, and it's an honor just to have an African perspective in this. When Robert asked me how I would want to invite you to come speak on this, he said the title is entitled DPI Brewed in an African Pot. And at first I was like, A lot of analogies came to my head. In Africa, we brew a lot of things. But I'll try and stick to the cleaner one. I'm going to talk a little bit about brewing tea as we talk about DPI. So welcome to my serving of a cup of tea as we also talk about DPI. Sorry, I think, is this working?
Yeah, just point it that way.
Point, okay. I need a 101 starter on how do, okay, thank you, whoever did that. I don't think I did that. All right, so the first thing that I want to highlight is I've been doing a research project on DPI, an African case with practical applications for Africa within the Carnegie work we do at the Africa program. And one of the things that we've done is develop a seminar paper. It's a draft piece. And I also first want to appreciate those who have been working with me on that paper. I know Diana Sang is here and Nanjira Sambuli, so I really want to appreciate the co-authors and the other minds that have come into this. So this is an extract of that publishing, which is coming out soon. So the first thing that we've looked up when we're talking about DPI in Africa is we've been talking to policymakers and other stakeholders. And the concept of DPI-1 is growing and it's being embraced within the continent. But one thing that we are beginning to notice is every time you talk to someone about DPI, they give you a somewhat similar understanding or definition of DPI, which started raising a lot of questions in my head. What exactly is DPI? We do know that there are three pillars, those ones of ID, payments, and data exchange. But the concept itself within this, the pillars, and it being interoperable, modular, and so forth, are great things, but the definition itself is one key thing that as a continent, as we believe in deploying this, that really needs to be looked at as an approach and how African countries are embracing it. The second thing is that we have seen that within these three pillars, there's already ongoing efforts, and I think this is really key to stress on this. The pillars itself on DPI, of course, as I said before, was this on digital ID systems. When you look and you scan across the continent, in the 55 countries recognized by the UN, We find a lot of countries already having their own foundational ID systems, and now there's a big push to having this digitized. So you're now talking about a variety of about 50 ID systems. And so what does that mean? So when you talk about DPI, it means different things to different people. When you approach it from an ID system, when you approach it from a digital payment system, there's a lot of digital payments already in the continent. There are those that do have the DPI concepts in them, but not many. And one of the things, there's a study done by African Nenda that has really been looking at inclusivity and DPI systems in Africa. And we continue to see the need for this to be interoperable and to be able to be instant payments across the continent. Today, if I want to send money to Egypt, I have not tried that. Maybe I'll try it before the end of the day and see how quickly that happens. But this is a common problem across the continent. And if we are talking about DPI, then we need to start having these continental frameworks. I know AU is in the room, and they're really doing some good work in trying to get some frameworks when it comes around to digital payments and digital ID. So it is a clear need for DPI, but also the governance frameworks around it. The third pillar is the most nascent one in the continent. Many countries are beginning now to put their data exchange systems into place. There are some that are leading the way. We have Ghana. I know there's some people from Uganda here. I've been reading some good case studies from there. So it's imperative, again, for me, it's just to unpack that there are already ongoing initiatives when we come to DPI, and a lot of countries then ask themselves, within these three existing pillars, and then within the DPI narrative, how do we start merging these two together? So there's a clear need of more research and more work to be done around this to ensure that what is there is already is being implemented and it's being pushed forward in the DPI narrative. Next. And here comes, now I'm serving my tea. When we talk about brewing tea, depending on where you come from, that narrative looks very different. When I first went to the US, I remember I asked for tea, and I was given a glass of iced tea, and I had never seen that in my life. I didn't even know the concept existed of iced tea. When you come from the African continent, your tea kind of looks like this, right? I see a lot of heads. Well, I don't know, maybe okay, I see some people saying that. Thank you. But in some places, you still get the black tea. Yeah. And people like that. So I'm trying to say DPI is also approaching, they're already existing. It's not a tabula rasa. There are already concepts of what digital systems look like. And depending on where you come from, someone will give you a different definition of it. So as we move forward, we need to recognize some of these elements as we brew this DPI, because we believe it's a good thing, it's digital transformation. We've been talking about digital transformation for ages, so how can we capitalize on this based on the local knowledge, and then as we move forward? I don't know if I'm the one doing this, but I keep clicking. Okay, there we go. So here is the first, we call this the preconditions for success for DPI in Africa, and there are three of them. I'll go through them real quickly. The first one that we need to recognize is that what I just said, there are already systems on the three pillars, and there are other digital systems already within the continent. So our question should be, how do we start embodying the DPI principles within these systems or applications that are already within the continent? Secondly, can we tailor to local political economies? I love the case of India and where DPI is coming out, but when we come to the African continent, we're talking about over 50 different countries. That means each of it has its own governance structure, and sometimes it's even tiered. There is local, decentralized, and so forth. So when it comes to systems, we have to be very cognizant of the very different governance structures that are there and the different kinds of political regimes within African countries. Thirdly, we're a youthful continent, full of talent, full of innovative ideas. Can we tap into some of these particular, I would call them demographics for the African continent? And last but not least, when we situate this, I would love to see an African stack or African stacks coming out of the continent. So we need some solutions that are very specific for the African continent. And then the second thing that in our research we are trying to say is, as we roll out DPI, the infrastructure imperative cannot be forsaken. Right now, we're talking about a continent that is 40% connected. DPI is digital public infrastructure. We have to continuously build that infrastructure. And not just the connectivity itself, but the energy. We are now entering into a phase where it's not just even about energy, it's about clean energy. How do we continue to run the digital systems that we need? And as you can see in that picture, depending on where you come from, energy looks a bit different to you. I don't know if any of you have ever sat in that kitchen where it smokes and your eyes tear all at the same time. But so we have to look at also ensuring that the energy that we're building is efficient and it's clean energy. Thirdly, we need localized capacity. I had highlighted about this. We need technical and policy capacity, so systems that are also building the local talent and the governance structures thereof. And thirdly, political buy-in. We know in most countries, if you want to build something, make sure you have the presidents, the ministers, and the lead political leaders to be part and parcel. And last but not least, we have in this research, we've come up with 7 policy recommendations that we believe can guide. That can guide policymakers moving forward, and also stakeholders, because I think this message is one for all stakeholders. The first one is we need to adopt the interoperable, that word. You know that word. Frameworks that help us to exchange goods and services across the continent. There's the digital ID. I think the African Union has really been instrumental in pushing forward a digital ID that identifies all Africans. Within, even if you're in a different country, you can still move freely across. Secondly, we need to integrate systems. There is the PAPS, the one for payments. It has not been adopted regionally, but this is something can help us. How do we start ensuring that mobile and digital payments can move across the continent? Third, we need to really see more and more countries fast-track their data exchange frameworks. I think it will be critical. Right now we have about 2 or 3 that are really coming up, because this is a really nascent and a new area for most African countries. Fourth, consider local solutions. Fifth, the infrastructure imperative. I cannot say that more and more often, that as we talk about digital in Africa, it has to be about inclusivity. How many people are connected? How many people are able to utilize this? The skills for people even to be able to deploy and to use these solutions. 6, again, political buy-in, develop a clear capacity building. And last but not least, let's prioritize locally homegrown solutions. And I would hope in the next time when we have another conference, we will be talking about an African stack or African stacks per country. But thank you very much.
Jane, thank you very much for your lightning talk on DPI, a practical approach for Africa. And with that, I'd like to pose some questions to my panel. And I'll start with our gracious host, Riham. We've heard a lot about Egypt's experience with digital public infrastructure. And in a few minutes, I just wanted to hear from you what has been Egypt's experience on DPI, and what are some of the lessons that this country is learning while trying to implement digital public infrastructure? Just in a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So how long would you want me to talk?
I'd like to say, thank you for being honest. I'd like to say 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wrote some notes so that I always have a lot to say, but I want to be very concise. Okay, our experience actually, like most of the countries, started with the ICT and the internet development and automation of systems, and then we moved more and more towards the e-government and the digital transformation. So we started in 2017 by developing the information infrastructure, where we integrated the registries of the public sector. And this actually was a basic step and a fundamental one to start with, because this integration, we would build on it a lot later. After that, we started with the connectivity and the inclusion, and like to spread and propagate the internet connections and the bandwidth so that we reach everywhere and no one would be left behind. And by the way, I like this saying that Mr. Nandan said it in the session today, that no one will be left behind, not like that everyone would receive a service. No, everyone would participate. and will have a role in the society. And this is more inspiring for this state. Capacity building on all levels. We had capacity building programs for graduates from the universities to bridge the gap between the academic output and the input for the industry, so that we can guarantee and ensure a sustainability for the industry of the ICT. We have developed capacity building programs for the students in the schools, for the government employees. So this is for the aspect and pillar of the capacity building. GovStack, of course, and the standardization of the components, the common components and the building blocks of the digital transformation. Egypt joined the GovStack Society 2.5 years ago, and we are heavily participating within the development and the technical specs. On the legislative framework, which is very important and critical actually also to ensure the sustainability of the digital transformation. We started with the personal information law, and now we are getting ready for the law for exchange of data between the public sector and the administration data. On the institutionalization level, we established DTUs, the digital transformation units inside every and each government entity and ministry, so that they would be decentralized under a centralized management for the transformation. The Supreme Council for Digital Society. We have this assignment from the President, and this is another aspect that is very important, that our processes and development work is gaining the support of the highest level in the country, the President himself. So we have an assignment to revamp all of the applications and processes of the government ministries and affiliations. Finally, we also established the GovTech Innovation Lab, where we include the startups, so that we have the industry engagement on all levels, from the multinationals, SMEs, and the startups themselves, to work on developing applications, mobile applications that would provide government services to the citizens with the participation of the citizens and the government stakeholders. The last thing maybe I forgot to tell you is that we are working now on transferring the government to a government as a platform, where we have all the government services into a number of domains, and each domain would be represented through a platform where the citizen would get providing of the services through the internet and the mobile applications. So hopefully I've covered it all.
Thank you very much, Riham. That sounds like Egypt is doing a lot of work, and maybe at some point after the summit is over, I'll request for some slides from you, so that sure. I can also learn and I can share them around.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to pose a question to Luke. Luke is from Smart Zambia, a country in which I have spent a significant amount of time. I think if I spend more time in Zambia, I'll be able to sing the national anthem. And I have seen where Zambia has started from in the last, let's say, 18 to 24 months. Yeah. They have made a lot of progress on their digital public infrastructure journey. Their mandates that run from the Office of the President, Smart Zambia itself, is housed within the Office of the President in Zambia. So look, I'd like to pose the same question for you in terms of some of the DPI initiatives that you're undertaking in Zambia, and what has been the impact to date. If you could take 3 minutes. I think Riham has set a good example, and so let's keep the same progress. Thank you.
You should have asked for more time. No, thanks so much, Robert. Yeah, and thank you everybody for giving us this opportunity to share our experience. So, when speaking about the Zambian context, I would quickly just give you a brief background in terms of where we stand. And I think I would like to leverage on what Jane said earlier on in terms of what happens in this space is that we are not building from scratch. There are always some of these initiatives which are already existing. And talking of the identity side in Zambia, we have a paper-based national registration card. We may not be as advanced as most of the other African countries in terms of having already a digital ID. We have a project to digitize, to have a digital ID, which has been running for some time, and for some time meaning over 10 years. And today, I think we have about 1.5 million records, which are in electronic or digital form. However, the situation is that we have the digital economy or ecosystem, which has overtaken the digital ID project, in that the various services are being offered electronically to the citizens. So this has now driven the desire to have a way in which we can properly identify or authenticate the people that are consuming these services. This is the question which we needed to answer. How do we move this process forward, and how do we get to answer this problem? And to do this, we instead of, because there's also laws regarding identity management and stuff. So what we did was instead, we used the act which we have, the Electronic Government Act, which mandates us to have digital registers set up for the various, for the enablement of the digital ecosystem. And using that, we have set up an electronic eKYC platform, which consumes the same data which is given by the paper-based identity number. So we're not giving anybody any new identity numbers. We are simply digitizing the records which are to do with identity. And not all the details about the person are digitized, but only a minimal set in keeping with the DPI principles of data minimalization. Yeah. So we have done that. That is, and we are glad, I think we can even say it here, that we've used the MOSI platform to do this. We are leveraging the e-signet component of the MOSI platform to make that happen. And so that is just one of the initiatives we are using. And just on that also, because of the cost of onboarding, we have gone by way of using existing data from other data sets or recognized trusted databases, which are run, of course, by the various government entities. And so far, we have about 7 million records that we are just cleaning up right now with the team. And once that is the audits are done on that data, we'll be able to go live, hopefully within this month of October. So that is something which we are very excited about, because we know it will answer quite a number of other things. And then this year, we try to remain positive in that we had, last year into this year, we had a failed rainfall season, and which by February, our head of state, His Excellency President Hakainde Hichilema, announced a drought, national disaster because of the drought. And that in itself posed challenges in terms of how do we then mitigate the effects of the drought in terms of social protection. We already had a solution for social protection, which is supported by the World Bank. We thank the World Bank as partners for that. But then when this came up, there were other institutions which do not have these digital solutions, which have also been given the mandate to go ahead and offer relief to the citizens. And one of which is the Disaster Management and Mitigation Unit. And so working with us, we said, okay, this is an opportunity for us to see DPI in action. What can we do? And so we had to build a solution. We went and picked one of the DPGs in OpenG2P, and then we had to quickly build. And when I say quickly, like we started in July to actually build this solution, and we are scheduled to have it go live also within the month of October. So it is, we've had very limited timelines to deliver some of these interesting or projects that we need to actually save the people, our citizens out there. So these are some of the things, projects we are doing. And one of the other key projects, which is also a demonstration of our stakeholder engagement, is the health sector. In the health sector, we have an electronic health management system, or EHR, which has been developed by one of our partners, a private entity by the name of IHM. And we have them with us, actually. I think after this session, I would encourage you to, I think they have a session somewhere, you can go and see what they are able to do. This is a solution that they've built from Africa. So Jane, it answers to some of that. African stuff can actually happen in here. So we have that solution. What we have done with that is, because their focus is on the health side, we've had to integrate the identity solution, the e-signet, with their electronic health record system to quickly onboard, to enable the fast onboarding, so that they'll just focus on what they have, their primary solution, and we have the identity component being managed elsewhere. So this, for us, is a true demonstration of how government can actually leverage on the partnership with the private sector to make some of these solutions come to pass, as opposed just to preaching them out. I know we're running out of time, but in terms of one of the big lessons we have learned, again, let me just go back to the drought. I think the drought really taught us a very big lesson, unfortunately, and this is on the infrastructure, the energy component. You know, we had it all set. We were sure we have enough coverage around the country in terms of the network coverage, but because of the drought, our country was reliant on hydroelectricity. And due to the lack of the rains, our hydropower generation has drastically dropped, or significantly dropped, to the extent that at certain times, we only have power for like 3 hours in a day or 2 hours in a day. So that has affected the capacity of even private sector to run some of these power stations, their communication towers, which then affects everybody. So now that is when now everybody is trying to look at what are the sustainable energy sources that we can actually do, which we can have to ensure that beyond just digitizing, the ecosystem can still be sustained when some of this power, the reliable power we are looking at, is removed. So Robert, with that, I'll take my rest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Luke. And I know Zambia has also been one of the first countries on the continent to roll out Starlink connectivity via the public sector. So I'll not ask you to speak about it because I know it's available. We can Google it. So I'll move on to my next panelist.
Thank you.
I'll shift gears slightly, and Alice, I'm going to bring you on. You've had a front row seat to policy development on this continent for many years, and also making recommendations both to government and private sector. And although Africa has been learning from a lot of DPI exemplar countries, including India and Brazil, what are some of the key policy recommendations you think are important in unlocking or fully unlocking the benefits of DPI from an Afrocentric perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and thank you to the other panelists and to Jane for that lightning talk where you started by reminding us that much of what is described at DPI right now actually emanated from digital IDs and fintech generally. And we do know that from a policy perspective and regulatory perspective, those two have had challenges. There's the good and the bad, and there's been quite a lot of challenges around policy and regulation. So discussions around DPI right now seem to underline expectations of inclusivity, safety, resiliency. I've had accountability being mentioned, transparency. The one word I haven't had being mentioned very often is trust in the design of such interventions. However, the interpretations of these principles or these values and the assessment of their satisfaction tends to largely rest on domestic implementing agencies, often without independent regulatory oversight. Like, what does that really mean, especially in the African context? And this has often proved a pain point for our citizens. When you look at Kenya, for example, and how difficult it is to get ID cards, even just physical ID cards, and we're rushing African governments to get into digital ID, and yet we haven't even reached the point where every person in the African continent has an ID, let alone, forget the African continent, even just Kenya, one country. We still have issues just issuing physical IDs. So most of these projects also tend to have government acting as a promoter and endorser of DPI, but its ownership lies with separate industry-owned corporate entities. A good example is our own citizen portal. It is a conglomerate of different private sector companies that are providing that, with the government itself not being a major stakeholder. So what does that say about our data and where it lies and how it's used, and responsibilities placed on the data controllers and the data processors. And there's also the issue of ownership of the digital infrastructure itself. It tends to rest in private companies with a public purpose. So the assumption is, because it's companies with a public purpose, that it's non-profit, implying that any profit that is gained from these activities or this DPI approach is plowed back and invested back to that. But is that really what is happening? And is there a danger that once again we come back to where our data is being taken out of our own countries and we cannot access it? So from a policy perspective, keeping a check on incentives, especially the shareholders of some of these companies that provide DPI facilities, is extremely important. And to also facilitates better decision-making and flexibility in recruitment and also procurement processes, and compared to, of course, government-run setups. But also this approach raises various competition and governance concerns. So yes, we should aim to break the silos that lock in specific networks, for example, those run by large e-commerce marketplaces, and instead facilitate interoperability, that hard word, and competition in the process. But then again, I ask myself, can such competition-inducing interventions also end up harming competition due to infrastructure monopolies? Because we know that in Africa, we don't have that level of infrastructure to handle that kind of data, so we are still reliant on foreign-based infrastructure organization. So these choices that have to be made by governments have really difficult choices to make here, tend to point to the emergence of an alternative big tech, literally reminding us again of what we have been dealing with big tech, although there's two different points. And they're designed to capture the state-backed monopoly of this infrastructure, their data aggregation advantages, the gatekeeping functions, control over technical standards. And so some concerns are raised about big tech, even though the two groups have different objectives in terms of business objectives. So from my point of view, and from Mozilla and my point of view, digital infrastructure operators nowadays, we are labeling them national information utilities in the spirit of DPI. But they are natural monopolies, actually, to be honest, and due to the so-called upfront sunk cost, economic of scales, network externalities from a surrounding ecosystem. And of course, the concerns about the privacy and the private ownership, but also the lack of suitable competition, governance and accountability, and safeguards, particularly in the light of these new power structures and these new monopolies. So instead of assuming the public spiritness and pro-competitiveness outcomes of DPI, these features have to be appropriately demonstrated in law and practice, so in regulation, in policy, and practice. And the responsibility of making these steps lies upon all of us in the multi-stakeholder model, so in domestic agencies, but also in part international agencies that are pushing, and the donor community that are pushing and fueling this global rush for DPI. For us, public goods should be open, accessible, shared resources at all levels, especially where cost, scarcity, privacy lock-in pose the greatest barrier to public participation. And public orientation should also center people and communities, especially those most underserved, by market-led capitalism development. And also public use should be prioritized. They should be prioritized in the public interest, especially those that are neglected by commercial incentives, like rural areas, refugees, and all of that. So I would advocate, from a policy perspective, applying the principles of openness. Openness as in fostering scrutiny, which allows for governance of privacy and standards and transparency and data collection. Openness as in diversity of input, diversity of collaboration, fostering development and privacy-preserving techniques that benefits everybody, rather than relying on security through obscurity. And then openness as in decentralization. That's extremely important because a lot of governments tend to want a centralized database, which is a honeypot for malicious actors. And so decentralization is extremely important. And that limits manipulation, targeted scams, online surveillance, and all of the other risks that comes with centralized. It should also be people-centered. It should be essential. We have to build major public infrastructure and goods with the goal of ensuring broad access that are beneficial resources rather than turning a profit. For example, roads, I'll give roads, parks, broadcasting, public broadcasting, back to that, public education, postal services, that are not focusing on profit. And technology is no exception with that. When we built, for example, the internet, it was an open global resource that should be accessible to all. And so, what does DPI look like in practice in Africa or in Kenya, for that matter? Should be available to the public, often should be open source, ensuring equitable access to a wide range of users, including researchers, developers, everyday users, our own startups. Solutions might be tailored to address specific local communities, not solutions coming from the global north being forced down the throats of African countries and African governments. It should also, the regulatory frameworks and policies and independent bodies, empowered independent bodies to regulate for oversight, and should be well-resourced as well to protect public interest and promote social good. And collaboration should be the currency. Open source must win, and collaboration should be the currency amongst different stakeholders. So the multi-stakeholder model is extremely important. And then educational materials and resources to help the public understand and engage, and especially promoting digital literacy and informed participation in this new so-called DPI ecosystem. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much,
yeah.
Alice. I forgot you are an economist, and so I thought I was taking a lecture on economics, but thank you very much for your policy recommendations. Magdi, I'll just bring you in from just given your private sector experience working with private sector partners in Africa across various themes, including economic inclusion, climate change, and human capital. What role do you think, from where you stand, the private sector has to play on the continent if DPI is going to benefit millions of Africans?
Thank you, Robert. I'm sorry if there's a few things I'm going to say. It would be a slight contrast, or at least a change in nuance. I think all of your points are well taken, and all of the panelists that I think a really informative session. So in what role does the private sector play? A lot of the conversations I've been recently around DPI talk a lot about sustainability. Do we have a model that is increasingly, for example, donor dependent? How do we make sure that these things actually do reach where they should go in terms of leaving no one behind? And if you think of the role of the private sector, it's really in innovation, scale, and sustainability. And the context is important. And yes, I believe that there is an extremely strong and important role for the government to be delivering the infrastructure. The reality in Africa is that governments have failed to deliver this infrastructure. Half of the continent is not grid connected. It does not have reliable access to power. We'll have the largest working age population in the world by 2050. The most rapid urbanization in the world, and governments have a hard time keeping up. The private sector is who's delivering the scale and innovation required to reach populations and can be doing a better job. But if you look at companies like, Flutterwave has reached, there's 30 currencies over it, 20 million API calls per day, and that's one company. Everybody knows about M-Pesa and the difficulties now, and almost a market position that becomes a bit difficult. But the fact is, everybody has read the MIT study about M-Pesa lifting something like 2% of people out of poverty, and that's one intervention. I know no public intervention anywhere in the world that has had that effect on a population. So we work on the private sector, and I had spent a lot of time in different institutions that are public or private sector facing, because they're driving the innovation. They're reaching citizens that others have not. And I see 2 or 3 key areas. You mentioned climate, human capital, and inclusion. So the inclusion is the fintech story, but also agricultural inclusion. How do you reach farmers who haven't been reached? And farmers are neglected. We've made an investment that is reaching farmers sustainably, using information to help make credit decisions. But in terms of human capital, I point to healthcare. 20% of the global disease burden is in Africa, but only 1% of the data used to make healthcare decisions is African data. So we're talking about LLMs or clinical trials, delivering markets. We have a startup that is working on putting together and structuring that data because frankly, it just does not exist. And so out of the necessity, innovation in Africa by the private sector is often driven by necessity, by the fact that those gaps remain. So how would we think about going forward in a model where we do want to see more public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure with the right values embedded, the right safeguards embedded? I think practically, I was speaking to a couple of the companies we were speaking to in Tanzania, who are, of course, TIPS is there, and it still needs some work, but they're in the payment space, so I kind of wonder, how do they think about TIPS? Is it a threat? How do they build on it? How do they make it more part of how they're sustainable? For them, it's great, because if TIPS lowers the transaction costs of low-value transactions, more people will use it in rural areas. But we said, well, what do you need to make it really more scalable? They would love to see the QR code, TAN QR, being developed so that merchants are actually accepting digital payments. Therefore, people have the reason to keep money on their wallets, which then makes them more sustainable, but also makes digital transactions more widespread, which then further lowers the cost, allowing them to expand their businesses. That's what's going to drive sustainability. It's scalability and profitability and some revenue share coming back to the government to make sure that TIPS is continuously updated and funded. So I don't think we can look at the private sector as the sort of bad guy or the good guy or whatever. If we want these things to scale and reach no one left behind, we have to be working with the private sector, especially in Africa, where so many gaps have been left by the governments. And I worked in government for a while, and I know that resources are extremely scarce. And so to ask that government I worked with, where we could barely pay the civil service budget, to then invest in a lot of infrastructure that is necessary to make the economy move forward, but they simply don't have the resources. they have no choice but to leverage the private sector and to put in place guidance and regulation. And in here, I think the role of all of us as stakeholders, especially civil society, to build local centers of capacity in Africa that can help shape the dialogue locally that then frames the kind of innovation needed in a place where, frankly, it is not going to be top-down government-driven. The resources aren't there. It'll be a combination of public and private, but that dialogue needs to be centered and bottom-up and included and embedded in how policymakers think about smart regulation to make DPI happen sustainably and scalably in Africa.
Magdi, thank you very much for providing us with that focus. And now, I'd like to close out my round of questions with the panel by bringing in Sabine. Sabine and the African Ender team have worked on getting to understand the extent to which instant and inclusive payment systems are being rolled out on the continent. African Ender produces an annual report of the status of instant and inclusive payment systems. And I'm very excited to announce that next month, you'll be launching the 2024 report. And I'm sure there's been a lot of changes since we last looked at the 2023 report. So payment systems are slowly evolving across the continent. And if you could kindly share, maybe not from the new report so that you don't leak any information, but from the past report, any key lessons on what's happening with instant and inclusive payment systems. If you could take a few minutes just to walk us through that, tell us a bit about your work at African Ender, and then we'll close out this session so that we can send everyone for dinner. Thank you.
Not sure. Oh, now it's working. So thank you, and I'm really thrilled to be here. So let me go down to what we found out on last year's report. First of all, it's not slowly. Africa is leading on instant payment systems. There are 32 instant payment systems live in Africa, out of which 29 are domestic level systems, so country level systems, and 3 are regional systems enabling cross-border payment. So, which is great for us. Now, from a typology perspective, there are 4 categories of instant payment system on the continent. In the early 2007 started with the mobile money instant payment systems, and then the banks join in with bank-led instant payment systems. And now we're seeing a more inclusive type, which we call cross-domain instant payment systems. And these systems enable interoperability all-to-all, so for facilitating transaction between mobile wallets themselves, bank wallets themselves, and mobile to bank and bank to wallet. And last type is one, and we have a one loaner on the ecosystem. It's a central bank digital currency-led instant payment system in Nigeria, the e-Naira. Now, collectively, these 32 systems are facilitating 32 billion transactions last year on the continent, and which represent close to 1.2 trillion US dollars in terms of value. And mind you, this is underestimated because 10 out of the 32 systems we were not able to get the data. You can see also our challenges in data collection. Now, with that said, we have to recognize that despite these statistics and what's happening on the ecosystem, half of people in the continent don't have access to an instant payment system. So we still have a long way to go. And also, the existing instant payment systems are not all inclusive. So that is also a key challenge in that ecosystem. And for us at African Ender, it really is a pleasure every year to collect as much data and information and perspective so we can share with the ecosystem and also help fast-track progress that's being made on advancing on the inclusivity of these instant payment systems. What we've learned also from a consumer perspective is that trust is a key component of the adoption process in digital payment. And that trust in the ecosystem is currently being tested with the increasing number of fraud that is happening in the ecosystem, particularly on instant payments. So our capacity as an ecosystem to provide recourse mechanism to consumers and to address, and strengthening the systems from a security perspective is a key element to build that trust and to enable more adoption at the consumer level. Now, from a learning perspective, I think what we can say is that you don't have to start the journey from scratch. There are a lot of lessons from Africa and outside of Africa. And our job at Africanenda is to bring this all together for the stakeholders to really just use what's out there, best practices that they can roll out. And 3 things I would say there. Inclusivity of payment system, it's a pathway that for us is really around 3 key components. The first one being inclusive governance, how the instant payment system is governed and the role that regulator, financial regulator, or others are playing in ensuring equal access for all licensed payment service providers to that instant payment system is a key, but also equal input opportunities, making sure that the scheme decisions are also taking into account the voice of all the ecosystem players to be able to make inclusive decisions and outcome for consumers. And interoperability of payment system is really the connecting tissue to enabling more access and usage for consumers, and making sure that regardless of which device, which provider, and where you are in that country, you are able to interact with the financial ecosystem through one interaction. The second piece from a learning perspective is building inclusive functionalities. We want digital to provide more value to consumers than what they can do with cash. That translates into building use cases for everything that you would do with your money. It's not just about person-to-person payments, but it's also about person-to-merchant, person-to-businesses. It is also about business-to-business payment, enabling channels for MSMEs to be able to transact and of course, do commerce across the continent. It is also about interaction with government, so government-to-person and person-to-government. So enabling all these use cases is a key. Enabling mobile as a channel to access these services is also a component of building these inclusive functionalities. And last but not least, it would be inclusive outcomes for consumer perspective. What does that mean, really? It's making sure that the ecosystem and the instant payment system is accessible to all, is affordable, so it's low cost, and it's also enabling low cost, low value transactions in that ecosystem, and it is providing these consumer recourse mechanisms that are very transparent and known to consumers, so when the system is not working in their favor, they know where to ask for support, and they have resolutions. So when you put that all together, it is an ecosystem play, and we all have a responsibility in that ecosystem, from governments, private sector, enablers, regulators, and these platforms, such as this Global DPI Summit, are key ones for us to share these best practices and advocate for more inclusivity, because we want a digital transformation in Africa that leaves no one behind. So thank you very much, Robert. And looking forward to seeing you in November for the launch of the SIPS Report 2024.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And after my wonderful panel has spoken, I'd like to close our session. But please join me in congratulating my panel on such a wonderful presentation and sharing knowledge. Thank you, everyone.